everybody, welcome to the last episode of our 2026 holiday season. Now, we started off this week of Christmas-themed reactions with a tasting history video, and so I thought it'd be only appropriate to end it with a tasting history video as well. So today we'll be reacting to World War II mincemeat pie for the Battle of the Bulge. So we'll get to see how the soldiers celebrated Christmas during the Second World War. Of course, a particularly dark time to be celebrating Christmas. We're going to take a look at the mince pie they were eating. I think mince pie is a lot more popular in the UK than it is in the US. Now, I've got experience. For those that don't know, I was born in the UK, moved to America as a child. I was never the biggest fan of mince pie. Sorry to anyone who enjoys it. And for those who are unfamiliar, modern mince pies typically don't contain any actual meat. It's typically, I believe, fruit, raisins, spices, maybe a little bit of fat in there. Sort of this spiced to fruity type of pie. Though I think older recipes did include some meat. I mean, I don't really know. Maybe we'll learn about it in this video. So, some exciting World War II history. If you guys end up enjoying this one, I'd appreciate it if you'd leave a like, subscribe to my channel, and check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. With all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction.
During World War II, Allied troops on the front would do anything for a taste of home, especially during the holidays. And so field kitchens would often do their part to bring around the Christmas spirit by making recipes like this one for mincemeat pie, which I'm recreating using a recipe from a 1945 Army cookbook.
Yeah, I mean, it's important to keep up morale on the front lines. I mean, also, it's just important that everyone gets to have some joy in the holiday season, even if you're fighting through one of the most brutal and grueling wars in history. But if you want to look at it from a more practical perspective, it's good to keep up morale, try to keep the fighting spirit up by reminding everybody of home, reminding everybody of what they're fighting for, and trying to give them a little bit of joy for the holiday season.
So thank you to Bombas for sponsoring this video as we feed the front lines on Christmas, this time on Tasting History.
Alrighty. World War II Christmas.
So this dish comes from a government manual filled with recipes that would have been cooked by the field kitchens in World War II. Now, much of the time, the menus were pretty monotonous, but during holidays like Thanksgiving and Christmas, they would always make an effort to bring a little holiday cheer to the troops by making things like turkey, stuffing, and pies. The cookbook has recipes for turkey, for cranberry sauce, stuffing, and pies like apple pie and pumpkin pie, but I thought I would go with a pie where there were actually two recipes for this pie in the book, and it was very popular at the time in the US.
Interesting. So that's interesting because mince pie is not so popular in the US today. I think it's seen as a very sort of traditional holiday pudding, more popular in the UK, like I said. I think most Americans would be familiar with it, and I'm sure plenty of people in America do eat it, but it just doesn't tend to be as popular as other, holiday treats.
Now, it's not so popular,
yeah.
And that is mincemeat pie. Now, it's not too far off from a traditional mincemeat pie in the fact that it has fruit and spices, though rather light on the spices. But since the recipe was meant for field-time cooks, there are a few differences. Like, instead of pieces of apple, they are dried apple nuggets. Instead of butter, it just says fat, which was typically Crisco or other shortening. And then just as mincemeat pies of previous centuries had, but had kind of lost by the 1940s, this mincemeat pie actually has meat in it.
Oh, wow.
Both meat flavoring in the form of bouillon cubes and actual meat in the form of canned corned beef.
Okay, that's very interesting. So I mentioned this in the introduction, right? Mincemeat pie, or mince pie. People who hear it for the first time, they think it is a meat pie. But mince pie today, mincemeat pie, is typically has no meat in it, right? It's mainly fruit and spices and things like that. However, in past centuries, it really did have meat in it, but it looks like this army recipe is a bit of a throwback to the past, and that they use that older practice of including meat in the pie, which is not very typical now.
And nothing says you're in the army now like canned corned beef. Now the instructions are pretty simple. It just says to dissolve bouillon cubes in boiling water, add remaining ingredients, simmer on a slow fire for approximately 45 minutes or until apples and raisins are tender. The addition of gravy coloring or caramelized sugar will improve the appearance. Remove from fire and cool, pour into pastry-lined sheet pans. Cover with a top crust and bake in hot oven 40 to 45 minutes or until crust is golden brown.
Well, I'm curious to see how this turns out. I mean, I know that mince pies did used to contain actual minced meat, right? But the only mincemeat pies I've ever had did not have any meat in them, as once again, they typically don't. And so I'm sure Max will tell us, I wonder how it tastes having actual meat in it. I imagine the flavor of the fruit and the spices will still predominate. Though he did say he's putting bouillon in it as well, so I wonder if it's going to have a meaty flavor. I imagine not, but I'm curious to see how it turns out.
Definitely not your typical mincemeat pie, but hopefully it'll still get me in the holiday spirit. Something else that gets me in the holiday spirit is cozying up by the fire with a cup of hot cocoa and a pair of warm socks from today's sponsor, Bombas. Now let me tell you something about Bombas. All of their socks are really well made and they're wonderfully comfortable.
And I'll say this, I've got Max's video linked in the description, so you could go and check it out. You should go and check it out. You should go leave him a like, subscribe to his channel. Always make sure to watch the original videos in full before you watch these reactions, and go and check out his sponsor if you'd like to support him. We want to say a thank you to Max for making these fantastic videos that we all enjoy. So I'll let the rest of the ad play through.
Slippers, which not only do I love, but so too do my cats. And on top of that, for every item you purchase from Bombas, they donate an item to a shelter. Socks, t-shirts, and underwear to those in need. So feel good and do good with Bombas, knowing that your purchase will do some real good. And new customers right now get 20% off of their first purchase when you use my link in the description. That is bombas.com/tastinghistory, and use my code tastinghistory20 at checkout. Now, this recipe makes 100 servings, because it's an army recipe.
Yep.
But I don't need that much pie, so I'm cutting it way back to about an eighth of that much. So for this recipe, what you're going to
That's still a lot.
need is 4 bouillon cubes, 4.5 cups or a little more than a liter of water, a half pound or 225 grams of canned corned beef,
Yum.
1 stick or 113 grams of Crisco or butter, 2 cups or 140 grams of dried apple nuggets, a heaping 3/4 cup or 170 grams of sugar, 4 1/3 cup or 400 grams of raisins, and then 1.5 teaspoons of cinnamon, 1/8 teaspoon pepper, 1/2 teaspoon nutmeg, an 1/8 teaspoon of salt, and an optional bit of gravy browning. And you can ditch
This is going to be really curious. I mean, it's a recipe for the army, so they've had to make it work, right? Obviously, they couldn't go for an entirely normal mince pie, but some interesting inclusions here.
the gravy browning if you don't want to. It's just there for looks. It's not really going to add much to the flavor. And I could almost even say the same thing about the spices, because you shouldn't ditch the spices. But there are really not very many spices in this, especially compared to a typical mincemeat pie, so...
Yeah, I mean, if I was, once again, to describe the flavor of a typical mince pie, it would be the spices you put in it. It's very spiced, right? And so that's what it usually tastes most like, along with some of the fruit in there. That's the overwhelming flavor. So once again, I'm very curious how this one turns out.
Yeah, curious how that's going to turn out.
Yep.
Anyway, let's get started.
Same.
First, you want to cut up the corned beef into little pieces, minced pieces, if you will. Then bring the water to a boil in a large pot and add the 4 bouillon cubes. They should dissolve in just a minute or so, at which point you can add the fat. Let that melt in, giving it a stir, and then reduce the heat to low and start to add in the rest of the ingredients. I started with the raisins, making sure that they were all broken up rather than in big clumps. And then once those were all in,
there's a lot of raisins in there, but you'd rather not get a massive clump of raisins in one bite. Or maybe you would, I wouldn't.
Dried apple nuggets, along with the very meager amount of spices and the sugar. Then stir all of that together, trying to get the raisins and apples to mix. The raisins want to fall to the bottom and the apples want to float, so it's actually easier said than done.
Yeah.
And then add in your minced corned beef and mix that in. Eventually the corned beef just kind of disintegrates, so don't worry if they're actually big clumps. Finally, if you do want to, you can add the gravy browning. Now it doesn't...
Yeah, I mean, I don't think the corned beef will make much of an impression, but it's in bouillon, so that's what I'm curious about.
It doesn't say how much to add, so I added about a quarter teaspoon, and I think that was enough. Stir it all together and then make sure it is just at a low simmer. Everything is actually cooked, so you're not really cooking anything. You're just kind of reconstituting the dried apples and plumping up the raisins with the water and getting all the flavors to get to know each other in the pot. So let it simmer for about 45 minutes, making sure to give it a good stir once in a while so nothing burns to the bottom. And then the recipe says that this should have 2 pastry-lined sheet pans. Well, I'm not making that much. Plus, a sheet pan does not fit in a conventional oven. It's just too big. So I am making a quarter sheet pan, which is much, much smaller. So once you have a pastry-lined sheet pan, you can put the filling on top of that and smooth it over, and then cut another piece of dough just a little bit bigger than the pan and set that on top of the mincemeat filling. Press the top and the bottom dough together around the edges and then give it a nice crimping, and then put on a light egg wash and cut a few holes in the top to let out the steam. Then pop that in the oven at 375 degrees Fahrenheit, 190 Celsius for about 45 minutes, or until it has a nice golden color on top. Now, while this kind of pie would have been eaten by many of the troops near the front lines, there were some who went so far forward that it was actually dangerous to get them meals like this, so their Christmas dinner would have just been the same rations that they had been eating pretty much every other day of the year. And then there were those troops who either went so far forward or got lost and ran through their rations, and so had to find food out and about and live on what they could find. And some of them found chicken soup being made in a cabin. And that chicken soup actually figures prominently in a true but almost unbelievable story that begins on Christmas Eve, 1944.
All right, let's hear it. Time for history. Just a note on the mince pie itself before we get to the history. Usually in these videos, I'm like, this would probably be pretty good. I'm not so sure this time, given the fact I don't really like mince pies in the first place, and also some of the unusual ingredients. I'm curious to see how this one turns out. But anyway, let's get into the history.
Christmas Eve of 1944, in the Battle of the Bulge, Germany's last great effort to push back the advancing armies rages on through the Ardennes forest on the border between Germany and Belgium.
Yeah, I mean, he's talking about guys who ended up far ahead, right? And this is the reason why. I mean, first of all, this was a pretty quickly advancing front anyway, but the Battle of the Bulge, the German army sort of pushes the front back out. And so you have a lot of Allied troops who essentially end up behind enemy lines. Previously, they were just at their own front line. Now they're behind enemy lines. And that's, of course, when you can't necessarily rely on your own supply lines. That's when you're going to have to scavenge or otherwise find food from local communities.
In a small hunting cabin, 12-year-old Fritz Winken and his mother Elizabeth are making a meager Christmas dinner as the sound of planes go overhead and artillery booms all around them, making for anything but a silent night. Now, they've been in this cabin since October, when they fled Aachen after it was bombed by the Allies. Fritz's father, Hubert, was a baker in Aachen, and after the bombing, he was actually kind of conscripted into the civil defense in the nearby town Monschau, and so he sent his wife and son to stay at his hunting cabin, not thinking that the Battle of the Bulge was going to erupt all around them.
Right.
Anyway, he was only 4 miles away, so they had been hoping that he would actually be able to come home for Christmas Eve, but it didn't look like it was going to happen, so they were preparing a meal just for the two of them when there was a knock on the door. Well, Fritz, thinking that it was his father come home for Christmas, runs toward the door, but Elizabeth, knowing that Hubert wouldn't have knocked, stops him and carefully opens the door just a bit. And Fritz, who is still inside, hears some voices of men, but they're speaking a language that he doesn't know. She realized before I did that these were American soldiers, enemies. Mother stood silent, motionless, her hand on my shoulder. They were armed and could have forced their entry, yet they stood there and asked with their eyes. It was 3 American soldiers who had gotten lost from their unit and were wandering in the forest for the last 3 days. Two of them were standing at the door, and the third was behind them, lying down in the snow, bleeding from a gunshot wound to the leg.
So that's a pretty dire situation, and I mean, we'll see how the story plays out. I imagine it's going to have a positive twist, but maybe not. What I will say, and you can't speak for every single civilian, obviously, but at this point, you're pretty deep into the war. A lot of civilians are not super thrilled with how things are going, at least in Germany, given that the war is finally coming back onto German soil. And so it wasn't uncommon for these Allied soldiers to get a neutral or even a positive reaction, depending on where they went, right? Once again, that's not a blanket statement, depended on where you stood politically and ideologically. If you look at Italy, for example, when the American troops arrived, a lot of them got a very positive reception by the Italian civilians, a lot of whom were pretty done with the war at that point, were pretty done with their fascist government, and a lot of whom actually had relatives in the United States. So a pretty positive greeting for a lot of these American and Allied soldiers. You know, the fighting was fierce in Italy, but it's even more fierce in Germany, right? The Battle of the Bulge, as the Allies are trying to push that front line back. And so the reception, it depended on, where you were and who you were talking about. But I guess we'll see how this story plays out in particular, right?
And Elizabeth looked at them and realized that they were kids. They were in their late teens and like 21. So she said, "Come in." Now, she didn't speak any English, and they didn't speak any German, but one of the men and she both spoke some French, so they were able to converse just a bit. And so she puts the wounded man on her bed and starts to tear up her bed sheets as dressings for the wound. And then she realizes the food that they were going to be making is not going to be enough for everyone, and she does want to feed them. So she turns to her son and says, "Go get Hermann and bring 6 potatoes." Hermann was the rooster that they had been fattening up in the hope that her husband would come home and they could have him for Christmas dinner, and they had named him after Hermann Göring, the Nazi leader she did not care for at all, and so, yeah, she named a chicken after him.
Okay, so it was like, named him mockingly. I was gonna say, you named your chicken after Hermann Göring, but I guess it was done in a negative sort of way. Okay. I guess that gives some insight into her particular perspective, right? Once again, I mentioned the reception you could get from civilians might depend on where those civilians stood ideologically. So it seems like at least this woman maybe was not a fan, clearly of Hermann Göring, maybe of the regime generally, which is maybe why she was a little more willing to take these kids in.
So before long, the cabin was filled with the aroma of a roast chicken and potato dinner that they were going to enjoy for Christmas Eve, when there was another knock at the door. And Fritz thought, oh, it's more lost Americans. So he goes to answer the door, and it's not Americans. It is 4 German soldiers.
Oh, God.
And later on, Fritz recalled that I was almost paralyzed with fear. For though I was a child, I knew that harsh law of war. Anyone giving aid and comfort to the enemy would be shot. And surely Elizabeth knew that as well.
This kid needs to be a little less eager with opening the door. Now, to be fair, in this situation, there's probably not much he could have done. If he hadn't opened the door, they would have made their way in. But this is real dangerous.
So she had to think fast, and she went outside and closed the door behind her. And the soldiers had also gotten detached from their group just that day, and so they just wanted to stay the night. And she thought and said, yes, you can stay the night, and I'll even give you a warm meal, but there are 3 other guests here, and you aren't going to like them, so you have to leave your weapons outside. Now, the leader of the group, who was a 23-year-old German corporal, he spoke up and he said he demanded to know who was in there and kind of figured it was Americans.
Yeah, she was sort of speaking in code, but it's pretty obvious code. You're like, okay, I'm pretty sure I know what you're talking about here. You're harboring the enemy. Uh-oh.
And she said, listen, you could be my sons, and so could they. A boy with a gunshot wound, fighting for his life, and his two friends, lost like you and just as hungry and exhausted as you are. This one night, this Christmas night, let us forget about killing." Then, before the corporal had any chance to actually object, she ordered the men, very strongly, ordered them to put their weapons on the wood pile. Then she went inside, gathered the weapons from the Americans, and brought them out as well, and left them all in the snow, and only then did she let the 4 German soldiers in. Now, I can only imagine the unbelievable tension in...
I was gonna say, I don't know, I imagine the vibe sort of took a bit of a dive at that point. A lot of tension. That's crazy. Like you said, almost unbelievable. But I believe it. I mean, I don't know if it's true or not. We're hearing a first-hand account, so this is something that definitely may have, and I think did happen. But yeah, it's, I mean, very much in the holiday spirit. Let's put our differences aside and let's just eat together and not, away with the violence. But things like this have happened in warfare. But yeah, this is a crazy story.
That cabin. It was like a one-room cabin. Unbelievable tension. And she also felt that tension and knew that they were hungry, and that would not lead to good things. And so she knew that she had to make more food. But her one rooster was not going to feed all 9 of them. So she decided, okay, go get some potatoes. She told Fritz, go get some more potatoes and some oats, and I will make a soup. So Fritz goes, gets more food, and when he comes back, he remembers that the tension had kind of melted away, and the wounded soldier was actually being tended to by one of the German soldiers who had until recently actually been a medical student. Now, it seems that only one of them spoke any English, so it's unclear exactly how much conversation was going on, but he basically ended up letting them know he's going to be okay, but he needs to rest and eat something and drink something. So he ends up resting, and Elizabeth ends up making this soup. And the corporal, the German corporal, to add to that, actually had a bottle of red wine in his pack. One of the other soldiers had some leftovers from a loaf of rye bread.
Nice.
And so with all of that, 8 of them, not the wounded man, but the others all sat together at a little table and enjoyed a meal.
Crazy. I mean, crazy. But once again, you do see acts like this throughout warfare, not just in the holiday season. And so this definitely wouldn't be the first or last time something like this has happened. And also soup, the eternal food of stretching the ingredients you have. I don't think soup is used so much in this way today, but particularly when people had food a lot less available to them, soup was a great way to take what you had and stretch it over more meals, or stretch it over more people, which is what this woman is doing here.
Tiny little truce in the middle of the Battle of the Bulge. In the story that Fritz told later about this evening, he said that they didn't really talk. They didn't know the same language. Instead, he remembers his mother crying, and then several of the soldiers also just sitting there crying as they ate. Then he said that just before midnight, Mother went to the doorstep and asked us to join her to look up at the Star of Bethlehem. We all stood beside her, except Harry, the wounded soldier, who was sleeping. For all of us, during the moment of silence, looking at the brightest star in the heavens, the war was a distant, almost forgotten thing. The next morning, Elizabeth woke up early and made some food for the wounded soldier, gave him some broth left over from the chicken soup, as well as a bit of the wine mixed with some sugar and an egg as kind of a tonic. And then she made oatmeal for the other troops. And then she took one of her best tablecloths, and the men attached 2 sticks, 2 poles to it to make a sort of stretcher so that the wounded soldier could be dragged on.
Wow, I mean, I'm curious how this ends, or if it has any particular ending to it, or a follow-up. But, I mean, I talked about the videos we did this week. We started with a tasting history video on, Christmas during the Great Depression, and how, during this time when people had so little, how they were still able to come together as families and still find a way to celebrate the holidays and do something special. This is like an even more extreme example where truly in the worst of times, you're in the midst of the Battle of the Bulge. You and your American buddies, one of whom is wounded or basically trapped behind enemy lines. You come face to face with a couple of German soldiers. This is about as bad as it gets. Like I said, the most deadly war the world has ever seen. An extremely brutal, gruesome, and grueling conflict for everybody involved. And yet, even during that, they're able to come together for a moment of peace, maybe some joy. Seems like it was more of a bittersweet moment than anything else, but still able to come together to celebrate the holiday and put aside the violence for just tonight. So that's a really special story.
Hopefully back to the American lines. The issue was that it had been 3 days now that the Americans had been lost.
Yeah.
And they didn't actually know where their units were anymore. So
Yeah, I mean, things were moving pretty quickly. Units were moving. The lines were moving pretty quickly. So it was pretty easy to get lost, detached, separated from your unit. I mean, this is a remarkable story, but it's not the only story of Americans being stuck or lost behind enemy lines, or sometimes it was even unclear where the line exactly was, particularly in this fast-moving Battle of the Bulge, right? So named because of the bulge the Germans created by pushing the line, well, backward, I guess. Forward for them, but backward for the Allies.
took out a map and are looking at the map, trying to figure out where they're going to go. And they eventually landed on deciding that they were going to go to Monschau, the town where Elizabeth's husband was. But the German corporal, overhearing this, told them that they had actually just retaken that town. And instead, they should go this rather circuitous route back to where he knew the Americans actually were. And to get them there, he actually gave one of the Americans his compass.
Wow.
Now, I would think that the Americans would actually have compasses, but he did give it to them, and the American soldier took it as a Christmas gift, I guess.
Yeah.
Then they all parted ways.
Wow, I'm surprised. I mean, I think once the story got into motion, it had to end amicably, or this would be a real tragic story. But I'm surprised that that corporal was even willing to tell them where to go and even give them a gift, the compass, right? Even the German soldiers were like, all right, get on your way. No, don't go there. We've retaken it. Go back to this city, which the Americans are located in. Damn.
Heading back to their respective lines to resume fighting with each other. Now, this story seems just a little too twee. It's just so sentimental.
Yeah.
And it is so sentimental that many people didn't believe it when Fritz would tell people. And
I think Max here is about to tell us about the veracity of the story. Is it true? Is it not? I mean, it seems very twee, very sentimental, very much in the sort of holiday spirit. Could be a fictionalized story. But, I mean, I've heard other stories sort of like this throughout the Second World War and throughout other wars. So I think it's possible. I guess we'll find out.
And he really was the only one who was getting this story out. He actually ended up moving, I think in 1959, to Honolulu, where he opened a bakery, taking after his father. He actually put this story into the Honolulu newspaper, and later on in the early 70s, it was in Reader's Digest. And a lot of people questioned it, being like, all right, this is a little too over the top, especially with things like the fact that he added the detail that right after the soldiers left the house, his mother went over to the Bible and opened it to the Christmas story and started reading, and her finger was tracing the last line from Matthew 2:21. They departed into their own country another way. I mean, it's like the worst writing of a Hallmark movie. It's just so over-the-top sentimental. And so a lot of people didn't really believe it. I mean, the kid was 12 when this happened. How clear was his recollection? But the story got out there, and it was often repeated, including by Ronald Reagan. He mentioned it in a speech that he made when he went to Germany in 1985. Then 10 years later, in 1995, Fritz actually told the story on an episode of Unsolved Mysteries. And that is when a chaplain at a nursing home in Frederick, Maryland.
I knew we were going to get some type of resolution. was like, Max, don't string me along to tell me, and we just had no idea if it's true or not.
And recalled that one of the people in the nursing home told him a very similar story. The man's name was Ralph Blank, and he had been a sergeant with the 121st Infantry, 8th Division in 1944. So Ralph actually contacted Unsolved Mysteries and told them, I was there that night, and it went down exactly like Fritz told it. It's all true. And the people at Unsolved Mysteries were like, okay, you're the right age, but can you prove?
Yeah, do we have some corroborating evidence? That's good. That's a good step in the right direction. I sense we're getting closer to solving this mystery. Okay, but can you prove you were there? Do you have any evidence of this? Let's see if he did.
That you were there? And like that scene from Titanic at the end, he says, yes, because I still have the compass that the German soldier gave me.
No shot.
Not long after that, Fritz ended up flying to Maryland to meet with him, and shortly before they both died, they actually got to meet. And Fritz then wrote, now I can die in peace. My mother's courage won't be forgotten, and it shows what goodwill will do. The inner strength of a single woman who, by her wits and intuition, prevented potential bloodshed, taught me the practical meaning of the words goodwill toward mankind. I remember Mother and those 7 young soldiers who met as enemies and parted as friends, right in the middle of the Battle of the Bulge. A heartwarming tale.
Wow. So, hey, look, sometimes facts can be stranger or more perfect than fiction, right? That's why I said, I mean, I can be pretty cynical about these types of things, right? You read a lot of mistruths about history, but one thing you do learn is that, you know, sometimes these stories really can happen, and I've heard similar stories. Now, I would say if a story sounds too good to be true, it usually is, but not always, right? It seems like in this case, I mean, I'd have to dig into it myself. I'm not sure how much evidence beyond that, but it seems like you had the story told by Fritz. You had the witness who came and corroborated it, apparently at the compass. Apparently him and Fritz met. So seems to me that that's corroborated at least. So there you go.
About a very small, limited Christmas truce that took place over a bowl of chicken soup.
I mean, hey, you can think about the beginning of World War I, when literally, and this didn't happen along the entire French line, but a lot of times the French and the Brits and the Germans got together to celebrate Christmas together. Sort of, you know, basically did a temporary truce over the holidays, played soccer with each other, ate together, right? And, you know, if you'd been hearing that for the first time, you might say, oh, that's too good to be true. But it wasn't. It really happened. Not everywhere along the line in World War I, but a lot of people really did have that experience, right? So this is one of those types of stories. Maybe embellished a little bit. You know, a lot of good stories are, but it seems like it probably did happen.
Now, I was actually inspired to do this video because of some research that was done on my family's history by Jarrett Ross over at the channel Genia Vlogger. I had told him that my grandpa was actually stationed in Germany just after the war at a hospital in Frankfurt, and then he did some deeper digging and found the Christmas Day menu that my grandpa would have eaten from on Christmas 1940.
Let's see what we've got. We've got tomato juice, roast turkey and giblet gravy, sage dressing, mashed taters, asparagus cranberry sauce. All right, that sounds like a nice Christmas feast with some pumpkin pie for dessert, some hard candy. That's why all of our grandparents love the hard candy, I guess. Fruit, hot roll and butter, and some coffee to end it. Hey, that's... I mean, I don't know what the quality of each of the ingredients was, but that seems like a pretty nice Christmas feast.
5. He even found an image of the mess hall that my grandpa would have been eating at for that meal.
Wow.
So originally, I wanted to make something from that menu, but it turns out I've actually made most of the things that were on there when I did the video on Thanksgiving in the Navy during World War II. So instead of repeating myself, I opted for this mincemeat pie, which should be about...
I was going to say, the mince pie wasn't really related to any of the history we learned. And that's not, whatever. That's fine. It was definitely an interesting story. But I was like, I wonder if mincemeat pie is going to come up at any point in this story.
Ready to eat. And here we
Guess
are,
not.
a World War II mincemeat pie from the US Army. So is it beautiful? No. But you know what? Mincemeat pie is never beautiful. I've made Victorian mincemeat pies and pretty much look the same.
It definitely looks like sort of an army brand mincemeat pie. You know what I mean? When I think of a mince pie, you think of a little pie. It's sort of circular. You can hold it. It's very pretty and well decorated. Of course, this is made in mass for soldiers, so it certainly looks like it's been made that way. I guess we'll find out from Max how it tastes.
No, it's just a bunch of fruit kind of mashed up. But it smells good. What it doesn't smell is spiced.
Yeah.
And that's usually what mincemeat smells like.
Yeah.
Lots of spices. This does not smell like that. So I'm curious what it's going to taste like. Here we go. You like raisins? If you like raisins,
Okay.
you like this. Very raisiny,
Raisin
which is
heavy.
not surprising. That's like the main ingredient by far. Can't really taste the apples. Can't taste the spices at all.
Yeah, that's a bit of a problem for mince pie. And I've said this before, but even good mince pie, I'm just not the biggest fan of, just personally. But if you've got a mince pie where you're mainly just tasting raisins, I'm sort of like, you're just eating raisins at that point. I mean, you should be tasting the apples should be coming through in there. The spices especially. I mean, when I say heavily spiced, it's meant to be heavily spiced. So I'm thinking the army just had a lot of raisins on hand. And they're like, oh, goddamn, what do we do with this? All right, let's make some type of weird sheet pan mince pie.
But it doesn't just taste like raisins. There are other flavors in there. It's rather unctuous. It's actually really kind of greasy on the mouth.
Well, there's a lot of beef, bouillon and stuff in there.
Not in a bad way.
Crisco.
I don't taste the meat, but
that's good.
The fact that there's bouillon in there, I can't taste the corned beef at all, but the fact that there's bouillon in there, I am getting like this savory note from it.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering. That there wasn't the beef, there wasn't that much of it in there, but the bouillon, I was like, that's got to give it a type of flavor. Savory.
I don't hate it.
I mean, I don't think a savory note's necessarily a bad thing, but I don't know.
I think with a lot more spices, because that's what mincemeat pie is supposed to taste like. Just like lots of Christmas spices. That's really what it needs to be.
That's the point, man. When you think of Christmas and the nutmeg and all these spices, chestnuts and nutmeg and blah, 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 that is sort of wrapped up in a mince pie for me.
And other fruits usually like candied lemon peel and orange peel and stuff. This doesn't have that. So it needs more spices and more fruit. But then really you're just making a different kind of mincemeat pie. This is a wartime mincemeat pie. So makes sense. Anyway, if you want to make a different mincemeat pie, I did a video a few years back on Victorian mincemeat.
That looks more traditional. There's no top on it, but you know.
Pie. So I'll put a link to that and to where on the Tasting History website you can look at that recipe. It's quite good. Whether you make it into pies or just eat the mincemeat, it is actually quite good. And that one also does include some real meat. Also, I'll put a link in the description to where you can go watch Jarrett Ross, the Genie Vloggers videos on my family, which is pretty awesome.
Oh, wow.
And have a wonderful, wonderful holiday. And I will see you next time on Tasting History.
Wow, he made a public video about his family, huh? Very interesting. All right, so that is Max Miller's World War II mincemeat pie. I guess he's made another mince pie, both of which have meat. He loves a good mincemeat pie with actual meat in it, which once again is not very common today. I don't know, it seems more like a raisin pie. I hate to say it. But I understand, it's war. You've only got so much you can do. Seems like they had what they had. And they were sort of like, okay, what can we do with this? We can kind of make a mince pie, but not really. You do think they didn't have more spices to put in it? I mean, really, if you just spiced it up a little bit more, probably would have tasted a lot more similar to a more typical mince pie. But that's coming from someone who doesn't really love mince pies in the first place. So there we go. We got some World War II Christmas history, some really fascinating stuff. And with that, that is the end of the History Student Reacts 2026 Holiday Extravaganza. We did a week's worth, roughly, of holiday reactions, a new one each day of the week. Thank you so much for watching these videos. I would really appreciate it if you'd leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. At this point, Christmas is past, but have a happy holidays, everybody, and have a good new year. The new year is coming soon, so I hope to see you all back here next time. Goodbye.